A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 35-2. Battle of the Haliacmon Part 2. The Pivot, Pre-Dawn, Day 7. The air before the dawn was thin and tasted of frost. Earlier, Philip had ventured into the dense stillness of the Athenian encampment, where he found General Iphicrates clinically inspecting his armaments. Unlike the Pellan guards, the Athenian soldiers were draped in light linothoraxes and gripped colossal spears, nearly double the length of standard infantry weapons. "It is far too long," Philip had murmured, his voice slicing through the camp silence. In the absolute chaos of a melee, is it not impossible to maintain structural equilibrium? If the enemy slips beneath the point, this massive ash would revert into an encumbering log. Iphicrates had dropped a freezing clinical gaze onto the young prince. Warfare is not a contest of brute strength. It is a clinical geometry of space and time. You shall sit within the perimeter and observe my mechanics. My force is a moving forest of thorns. By that distance, the enemy is forbidden from ever touching our flesh. Now, standing beneath a canvas awning with the battle imminent, Philip watched the general check the tension of a bowstring with the same detached care one might show a ledger. Every javelin that whistled into the night was a stroke of a pen in the Athenian's book. Philip felt a sharp, acid bitterness rising in his chest. He realized the courtesy of war was a lie. If Iphicrates broke Pausanias without a single Macedonian sword raised in earnest, the throne would be a gift wrapped in Athenian linen, a kingdom held by the grace of a general, not the blood of its own line. "I cannot let the Athenian write the end of this story," Philip decided, his jaw tightening. He stepped away from the maps, moving toward the periphery of the camp, where a group of Theban captains sat huddled around a low burning fire. He approached them not as a boy, but with a deliberate, haunting stillness that drew their eyes. "The Athenian is efficient," Philip said, his voice a low, steady murmur. "He is tearing Pausanias apart to ensure no one remains to contest his protection of our borders. But a ledger can be burned. If the Athenian wins this alone, the Argead name will be nothing more than a footnote." He knelt, the firelight catching the hollow, cold intelligence in his eyes. "When the crossing begins, I want to know who among you remembers that there is a difference between a protector and a conqueror. If the Athenian falters in the pass, if he finds his forest of thorns blocked by the very geography he claims to master, where will your steel point?" He left the question to fester in the heat of the fire, not waiting for an answer. As he walked back into the shadows, he felt Parmenian's eyes on him, a heavy, knowing weight. Philip did not look back. He had begun the slow, dangerous work of building a foundation that did not rely on the Athenians' reach, and for the first time, the cold, frozen iron in his heart felt like the beginning of a crown. Day 7, the floodplains of the Haliacmon River, Lower Macedonia. The pre-dawn light was not the promise of a new day, but the cold gray color of a shroud. In the royal tent, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the scent of unburned lamps and the metallic tang of fear. Eurydice paced the length of the tent, her fingers white as they gripped the fabric of her stala. She stopped at the window, peering through the gap in the heavy hangings toward the river. "There," she thought, her breath hitching in her chest. "He's out there in the van. The bait." "They have moved," Urano whispered from the corner, her voice barely audible, though it cut through the room like a blade. She sat on the edge of a chest, her hands trembling in her lap. "Do you see them, Mother? The banners?" "Philip and Attalus are riding straight into the teeth of the usurper's line." "I see," Mother replied, her voice an iron mask that hid the frantic, hollow thudding of her heart. She looked toward the empty cot where Philip had lain only hours before, the space where her son, her fierce and reckless ambition, had finalized his gamble. He was riding into the maw of the usurper's infantry to fracture their formation, and there was nothing, that could shield him from the iron once the lines collapsed. Urano stood up, her composure fracturing. "He is only 14, Mother. He has the wisdom of a prince, but the blood of a child. If Iphicrates' gamble fails, if the usurper realizes the trap and closes it around Philip instead, we are not just losing a battle. We are losing the house of Argead." Eurydice turned, her eyes dark and burning. "If we have lost them, we have lost everything. Perdiccas has the throne, but Philip has the hunger to make it mean something. If he dies today, the wolves won't just take the borders, They will tear the very heart from Pella. I can't breathe, Euryno confessed, pressing a hand to her throat. Every time I hear the distant thunder of the horses, I think it is the news of our ruin. He is the lure, mother. He is the one Pausanias is hunting. It sounds like a grave, Eurydice murmured, her inner thoughts spiraling into a desperate silent prayer she refused to voice. Let him be cunning. Let him be as cold as the iron he prizes. If he must survive, let him not be a hero. Let him be a king. Outside, a distant, muffled roar rose, the sound of thousands of men finding their courage, or perhaps their end. Euryno flinched, instinctively reaching for her daughter. Mother, if the trap holds, if they pivot to crush him before the Athenian center can break them, they will hold. Eurydice cut her off, though her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, wide and unseeing. They must. We have gambled the entire legacy of our blood on this one turn of the tide, on his ability to draw the usurper into the kill zone and survive the weight of the collision. She looked down at her own hands, seeing them tremble, and forced them behind her back, hiding the evidence of her terror. Come away from the window, Euryno. We cannot afford to watch the disaster unfold. We have to wait for the message, and we must be ready to command the silence when it comes. Gods of our fathers, Eurydice thought, her heart hammering against her ribs, grant him the sense to survive the genius of the men he serves. Do not let his ambition be the stone that drags him to the bottom of the Haliacmon. The air before the dawn was thin and tasted of frost. Inside the command tent, the tension had reached a snapping point. Iphicrates stood before the map, his hand gripping his spear with a proprietary, clinical coldness. He did not look at the other commanders. His gaze was fixed solely on Philip, his eyes devoid of any warmth. We discussed the mechanics of this yesterday, Prince, Iphicrates said, his voice dropping into a lethal, measured cadence that served as a cold reminder. You remain the bait. You are to ride with Attalus on the right wing, not for the sake of glory, but to ensure Pausanias remains obsessed with the royal prize. He tapped the map sharply, his finger hovering over the rugged terrain. As we agreed, the moment he sees the Argead prince exposed, he will abandon all tactical restraint to rush your position. When he pulls his heavy infantry out of their formation to secure your head, he will tear his own wall of shields apart. Do not forget our pact. Hold his attention just long enough to fracture him, and you draw him directly into the kill zone. Iphicrates leaned in, his gray eyes piercing the boy. You are the magnet, Philip. The entire outcome of this day relies on your ability to remain the target until the precise moment I trigger the trap. See that you do not forget your role. After the general departed, Philip stood at the edge of the circle. He realized the courtesy of war was a lie. If Iphicrates broke Pausanias alone, the throne would be a gift wrapped in Athenian linen, a kingdom held by the grace of a general, not the blood of its own line. He intends to keep me on that flank as a tool for his own geometry, Philip decided, his resolve hardening. I will be the bait, but I will not be his puppet. I will be the pivot upon which this battle turns. Philip stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tent with a weight that defied his ears. I am ready for the flank, Philip stated, locking eyes with his brother. I will be the bait that draws the usurper out, but understand this, once the trap is sprung, I will not be a passive lure. When I lead them into the pass, I intend to break their line before they even realize the center has folded. Perdiccas looked toward Attalus, then nodded slowly. The plan stands. Philip will act as the lure, the blood of the Argeads exposed. When Pausanias commits his heavy infantry to crush him, you do not hold back. You break them. Ismenias's eyes narrowed, weighing the prince's plan against the Athenians' rigid master plan, while Parmenion stopped his pacing, a flicker of grim recognition passing over his face. Philip did not wait for further debate. He moved toward the periphery of the camp, where a group of Theban captains sat huddled around a fire. He approached them with a deliberate, haunting stillness. The Athenian is efficient, Philip said, his voice a low, steady murmur. He is tearing Pausanias apart to secure his own influence. But if the Athenian wins this alone, the Argead name will be a footnote. Tomorrow, I will ride in the van to draw them into the pass. I will be the vulnerability that tempts the usurper to abandon his formation. He knelt, the firelight catching the cold intelligence in his eyes. When the crossing begins, I want to know who among you remembers that there is a difference between a protector and a conqueror. If the Athenian falters, if he finds his forest of thorns blocked by the very geography he claims to master, where will your steel point? He left the question to fester in the heat of the fire. As he walked back into the shadows, Parmenian's eyes tracked him, a heavy, knowing weight. Philip did not look back. He had begun the slow, dangerous work of building a foundation that did not rely on the Athenians' reach, and for the first time, the cold, frozen iron in his heart felt like the beginning of a crown. The usurper Pausanias had established an arrogant, rigid formation upon the rolling floodplains adjacent to the Haliacmon river. His column was a chaotic, patched mass, a mercenary army composed of roaring Thracian tribesmen, exiled Macedonian barons, emitting the foul musk of sour wine and desperation, and a hard core of heavy Greek mercenaries. Overestimating his massive numerical superiority, the usurper adjusted his gilded mantle, his heart hammering with a greedy, impatient rhythm as he naively dreamed of a traditional, head-on collision of shields. He wanted a clean, glorious crushing of bones. He wanted the throne of Macedonia washed clean in Athenian blood. Yet, Iphicrates was not a commander who operated with the soul of a hoplite. He entered the blood feud with the freezing, clinical detachment of a bird of prey. Standing on a low ridge, his gray eyes swept over the massive enemy host, not with fear, but with the cold calculation of a tax collector auditing a ledger. The bigger the beast, he mused, a cruel, faint smile tugging at his lips, the more joints there are to sever. They did not starve for a noble, metrical duel. They mapped the dark solely to execute an asymmetric slaughter. Across the river, the landscape was a tapestry of shifting allegiances waiting to be torn. The Theban vanguard stood at the primary ford, their heavy formations locked into the oblique geometry Iphicrates cherished, a wall of iron that functioned as the anvil for the coming hammer. They were the professional corps, yet among their captains, a seed of doubt had been sown by the prince's low, haunting whispers. Behind them, the Macedonian army formed the shield. They waited in the damp morning, their gazes shifting from the rigid Athenian lines to the distant high ridge where the Argead prince was supposed to be a spectator. They were soldiers tethered to a phantom authority, their morale a fragile thread between the duty they owed their king and the pride they felt for the boy who had defied the general. Tucked into the jagged, hidden teeth of the upper river were the loyalist civilians and veteran irregulars. They were the stiletto in the coalition side, a force not of the Athenian grid, but of Philip's singular, burning ambition. They waited in the brush, their blades sharp and silent, their movements a stark, fluid contrast to the grinding, mechanical pace of the mercenary host across the water. They were the variable Iphicrates had not accounted for, a force that did not need a map to know where the heart of the enemy lay, only the iron-scented resolve of a prince who had finally stepped out of the shadows. Perdiccas had finally relented to that resolve in the dark of the command tent, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and pride. "Philip, you will ride with the talus on the right wing," the king had declared, the order cutting through the frost-laden air. "Your presence there, the blood of the Argeads, will turn this from a mercenary action into a royal crusade. When the trap springs, you do not hold back. You break their line before they even realize the center has folded." Now, as the first light touched the Haliacmon, a thick, suffocating morning fog rolled off the river, clinging to the tall grass and shrouding the battlefield in a ghostly silver veil. Through this damp, swirling gray, Philip watched from the periphery, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade so tightly his knuckles shone like bleached bone. The memory of the command tent burned in his mind, the way his brother Perdiccas had finally surrendered his caution to the necessity of the moment. "Philip, you will ride with the talus on the right wing," the king had commanded, the weight of the crown heavy in his voice. "Your presence there, the blood of the Argeads, will turn this from a mercenary action into a royal crusade. When the trap springs, you do not hold back. You break their line before they even realize the center has folded." Philip was no longer a spectator destined for a ridge. He was the edge of the blade, and he was ready to carve his own meaning into the map. Beside him, Attalus adjusted his grip on his own reins, his figure half obscured by the drifting mist. The old commander's presence was a jagged, grounding weight. His beard was silvered by years of campaigning, and his eyes, deep-set, unweary, held the calm of the man who had survived more crusades than Philip had years of life. He did not offer words of comfort. He simply checked his horse's bit, the rhythmic clink of the metal serving as a metronome for the coming slaughter through the white damp shroud. Yet, as the horses shifted, their hooves churning the dew-slicked grass, a cold electric shiver raced down Philip's spine. This was the first time he would truly be the bait, the vulnerable point upon which the enemy's gaze would shatter. He knew the tactic. He was to gallop into the teeth of the usurper's heavy infantry, feigning a reckless, suicidal charge. He had to be the magnet drawing the mercenary eyes away from the shifting geometry of the Theban ford and toward the royal crusade on the flank, even as the fog turned the world into a claustrophobic, sightless maze. If I misjudge the speed, he thought, his heart drumming a frantic, syncopated rhythm against his ribs, if I hold the line for even a heartbeat too long, the Argead blood will be nothing more than a stain on the riverbank. He felt the terrifying, singular isolation of command. For all his posturing, this was the first moment he was entirely untethered from the safety of the pavilion. He looked at his own hands, steadying the reins through the haze, and felt a strange, detached exhilaration blooming beneath the fear, a dark, crystalline clarity. He was the prince, yes, but today he was a projectile. He had to embody the arrogance of his lines so perfectly that Pausanias would salivate at the prospect of a royal kill, pulling his men out of position, fracturing his own wall just to reach for the boy in the mist. Attalus glanced over, a grim, knowing shadow touching his lips as the fog clung to his cloak. "The usurper's eyes are already fixed on your banners, lad," he murmured, his voice like gravel grinding under a boot. "See how their ranks begin to pull toward us. They think you are the crown. Don't disappoint them. Make them believe you are the only prize worth dying for. Let them see me," Philip thought, narrowing his eyes as he caught sight of the usurper's gleaming, gold-wrought banners barely visible as ghostly shapes across the shifting vapor. "Let them believe I am the prize. By the time they realize I am the trap, there will be no kingdom left for them to return to." He took a breath, the cold, wet air filling his lungs, and signaled to Attalus. The mask of the boy prince fell away, replaced by the hardened, predatory stillness of a man who had already decided he would not die today. "Keep your torsos flat to the dirt," the Athenian Navarchus whispered through the dark, the sound no louder than the wind rustling the stalks. "Do not hunt for their shields. Fix your eyes exclusively onto their exposed throats and bare thighs." They unleashed a relentless, blinding deluge of light javelins directly into the lines of tethered warhorses. The terrifying shrieks of the mutilated beasts, wild, high-pitched horse screams that shredded the night air, completely masked the wet, visceral impact of iron-piercing human flesh. In the tents of the usurper, panic spread like oil on fire. Soldiers stumbled out into the pitch black, blindly slashing at shadows, their own weapons cutting down their comrades in the confusion. From the command rise, Attalus watched the northern bank dissolve into a frantic, howling slaughter. He gripped the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white, his jaw set in a line of grim approval. "A butcher's work," he muttered, though his eyes lacked the detachment of the Athenian. "Efficient, perhaps, but it leaves nothing behind but meat." Parmenion, standing just behind him, did not share his unease. He watched the chaos with the hollow, seasoned calm of a man who had seen 100 such dawns. The Athenian has no interest in what survives, Parmenion thought, his gaze tracking the way the Athenian peltasts moved in the dark, ghosts that required no sleep, no glory, only the kill. He tears the spine out of an army and calls it geometry. He thinks he is teaching the boy a lesson in command, but he is only teaching him that loyalty is a currency that can be bought with blood. "The usurper's lines are broken," Parmenion, Attalus noted, looking toward the silent silhouette of the prince nearby. "The bait is set. If we move now, we could end this before the sun touches the river." Parmenion did not look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on Philip. He saw the way the boy's shoulders held the weight of the night, not with the uncertainty of a child, but with the cold, predatory patience of a wolf waiting for the trap to spring. The boy was not merely observing the butcher. He was studying how the blade was held. He was waiting for the moment when the Athenian thought he had secured the victory, so he could show him exactly who owned the ground. "Let them scream," Attalus, Parmenion replied, his voice barely a murmur. "The Athenian wants the chaos. The prince wants the aftermath. We hold our position until the signal. By the blink of an eye, the sun began to bleed across the horizon, and Pausanias' mercenaries were shivering, their eye sockets hollowed by a sleepless, maddening panic. Their psychological baseline had been thoroughly torn to pieces by an invisible adversary that materialized within the dark and dissolved into the morning mist. Attalus turned to the prince, his aging face etched with the grim resolve of a veteran. "The moment is here, my prince. The center is reeling and the wall is fracturing. We move now." Philip drew his sword, the steel singing in the cold air. This is not just a charge, Philip thought, the cold iron in his heart finally aligning with the heat of the sun. This is the severance of the old world. Beside him, Attalus mounted his charger, signaling for the loyalist irregulars and the cavalry to draw their blades. Philip leaned forward, his eyes burning with the cold clarity of a man who had ceased to be a spectator. "Attalus!" "To me!" Philip shouted, his voice ringing out across the frostbitten field. "Men of Argead blood, follow my lead. Let us show them who commands the ground." Finally, Attalus mused, the blood hunger of his youth surging to meet the rhythm of the gallop. The boy is not playing at war, he is becoming it. Behind them, the riders thundered forward, their own thoughts eclipsed by the terrifying, exhilarating proximity of the prince. "We are the death of the usurper," they thought, their fear evaporating into the singular, violent purpose of the line. "We are the blade that decides the dynasty." From the ridge, Iphicrates watched the golden figure of the prince surge forward, his lips curving into a thin, shark-like smile. There is the bait, the general thought. He acts with such conviction, he almost forgets he is merely the instrument of my geometry. Beside him, Parmenion stood rigid, his eyes tracking the boy's every movement with an intensity that bordered on prayer. He is no longer playing the part, Parmenion realized, a flicker of genuine shock piercing his seasoned calm. He has taken the role Iphicrates designed and transformed it into a throne. He is not bait, he is the hunter. Ismenias, the Theban, watched the charge with narrow, cold eyes, his hand resting on the pommel of his xiphus. He leads with the reckless fire of a boy, yet he maneuvers with the instinct of a king, the Theban observed, his disdain giving way to a grudging, wary respect. He has committed himself fully to the trap. If he survives the collision, he will be the one holding the leash of this victory, not the Athenian. With a roar that shattered the lingering silence of the valley, Philip kicked his mount into a gallop, surging toward the enemy line. Attalus surged forward at his shoulder, and behind them, the loyalists screamed their war cry, the sound of 1,000 iron-shod hooves thundering into the earth as they charged to become the final decisive weight that would collapse the usurper's broken heart. Out from the thick, rolling banks of the river fog they emerged, ghosts suddenly made of flesh and iron. Like a thunderclap breaking from a silent cloud, Philip, Attalus, and the wedge of loyalist horsemen burst directly onto the enemy's exposed right flank. To Pausanias' shivering, disoriented mercenaries, the sudden apparition of the Argead prince charging out of the white shroud was a terrifying shock. The fog parted to reveal the flashing hooves, the raised spears, and the gleaming Argead banners bearing down on them. They hit the panicked mercenaries like a tidal wave. The prince's blade flashed in the cold morning light as they carved a path straight through the shivering ranks. Beside him, Attalus' heavier horse crashed into the fractured line, his veteran steel cutting down the first line of defense before the enemy could even pivot to face the threat. Together, they shattered the usurper's formation from the inside out, turning a clinical retreat into an absolute rout before the Athenian center could even claim the final blow. Ismenias remained a silhouette of stillness against the backdrop of the Macedonian command, his fingers tracing the edge of an unfurled scroll with the rhythmic intent of a man testing a blade's edge. He surveyed the usurper's camp not as a soldier, but as a pathologist watching a terminal patient. "The Athenians' efficiency is seductive," he murmured, his voice a dry, rasping friction. He treats the theater of war as a clinical vacuum, stripping away the variables of tradition to solve for the raw equation of survival. It is brilliant. And it is, by necessity, entirely soulless. The Athenian imagines he is the master of this logic, Ismenias mused, his dark, unimpressed eyes shifting toward the right flank, where Philip and Attalus were now moving to shatter the line. He believes he is conducting a symphony of attrition, unaware that his own score is being rewritten by the very boy he dismissed as a mere spectator. Iphicrates tallies a victory in his ledger, I see a vacuum of power expanding in real time. The Theban advisor watched the prince's charge with a flicker of genuine interest. If the Forest of Thorns holds, Iphicrates will become the architect of Macedonia's future. But he is blinded by the elegance of his own kill. He fails to realize that the wolf he invited into the fold is already measuring the depth of his throat. He snapped the scroll shut, the sound like the crack of a dry bone. Pausanias is a hollow man, and he is about to be filled with the consequences of his own arrogance, Ismenias stated, his gaze fixed on the unfolding chaos near the Haliacmon. But do not look to the center for the true victor. The Athenian science will dismantle the vanguard, but mark my words, this day will be claimed by the prince's hunger. Philip is not fighting for a battle. He's fighting for the crown that Iphicrates thinks he is merely guarding. The instant the dawn broke, revealing a battlefield littered with bleeding horses and mangled scouts, the thick morning fog began to churn, swirling like a living shroud over the Haliacmon. Pausanias cracked. Terrified by the unseen terrors that had decimated his outriders, he shrieked the signal for his heavy infantry to advance. They carry no authentic bronze. They wear nothing but stitched rags, Pausanias roared, waving his sword at the thin, ghostly lines of the Athenian front. Trample them into the mud. Iphicrates stood behind his line, his posture as motionless as a statue. He watched the wave of panicked, heavy armored infantry surge into the mist. He did not blink. He did not draw his own blade. Instead, he adjusted his helmet, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits as he watched the enemy's formation stretch and distort, lured deeper into the trap by a flash of movement in the fog. Suddenly, out of the swirling white haze, two figures emerged at the head of a small, thunderous wedge of cavalry, Philip and Attalus. They appeared not as ghosts, but as a defiant, glittering target, galloping recklessly toward the usurper's right flank. Pausanias' eyes widened, his greed overriding his fear. "The prince," he screamed, his voice raw with frantic triumph. "The Argead whelp is exposed. Forget the rags, crush the boy." The usurper's heavy line, already brittle with fear, tore itself apart to pivot toward this new, royal threat. They abandoned their cohesion, their shield wall fracturing as they bent entirely toward the bait. "Let them believe it is a trophy they chase," Iphicrates murmured, his voice a calm, rhythmic pulse to his adjutants. When a man is governed by his greed, he sees only what he desires to destroy. He thinks he is cornering a prince, when in truth he is throwing himself onto a wall of needles. He watched the enemy formation buckle. Pausanias had discarded the discipline of the phalanx for the desperation of the hunt. He failed to realize that the fog had merely served to amplify the distance between his fractured wings and his reeling center. The moment the usurper's lines buckled under the magnetic pull of the royal prize, Philip and Attalus reined their chargers in hard. The horses reared, hooves churning the blood-slicked mud before the pair wheeled sharply away from the impending collision. As they vanished back into the swirling, silver-gray mist, the effect on Pausanias' mercenaries was catastrophic. Deprived of the target that had driven their chaotic advance, the overextended infantry stumbled forward, breathless and exposed. Their momentum carried them directly into the waiting path of the Athenian phalanx. Iphicrates, watching from the ridge, did not wait for the dust to settle. He slammed his hand down on the command rail. "Now," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Close the garden." Before the usurper's men could steady their shields, the Athenian line stepped forward in a synchronized rhythmic crunch of iron. The Forest of Thorns dropped into place, the long ashwood sarissas leveling with terrifying finality. Pausanias' men, robbed of their bait caught in the momentum of their own greed, realized only a heartbeat too late that the prince had never intended to fight them. He had only intended to bury them. Iphicrates signaled the standard-bearer with a single sharp gesture. "They want a collision? Give it to them. Let them see how little bronze matters when the ground itself has signed their death warrant." As the clumsy, top-heavy mercenaries plunged into the uneven terrain, their rigid shield wall, perispicimus, warped and fractured against the natural ridges of the earth. Gaps opened up in their front line like tears in rotten cloth, leaving them entirely defenseless against the encroaching steel. From the high, windswept ridge, Queen Eurydice watched the formation splinter, her knuckles white as she gripped the rough stone of the parapet. Euryno stood just behind her, her breathing ragged and thin as she witnessed the unfolding nightmare. Beside them, two stone-faced guards stood motionless, though their hands remained white-knuckled on their sword hilts, their eyes fixed on the slaughter below. "They are moving," Urano whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed toward the riverbank. "God's mother, there he is." Philip is in the van, riding right into the teeth of them. Mother's gaze remained locked on the riverbank, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew this was the plan. She had helped forge the strategy, but seeing her son emerge from the swirling white shroud, a solitary, golden target deliberately inviting the chaos, was a refined agony. She watched as the mercenaries shifted, their focus snapping away from the river ford and locking onto the prince, like starved hounds sensing blood. "He is the stone," she realized, her voice a low, chilling rasp that carried the weight of a queen's command. "He's not merely writing, he is shattering their gears." They fight for a king who has already burned his own bread, and they charge at a general who views them as nothing more than a variable to be removed. But they are charging at Philip, and they have forgotten everything else. Pausanias has handed the field to the Athenian, Eurydice thought, her hand tightening on the fabric of her mantle until her nails dug into her palm. He thinks he's pressing a charge against a royal prize, but he is feeding Iphicrates the victory he needs to claim the protectorate of our lands. The general will win this battle, and in the eyes of every noble in the coalition, he will look like a god of war, while my own son is reduced to a guest in his own kingdom. She turned her head slightly, meeting the eyes of the guard and her daughter. "If the Athenian wins this while we stand idle on this hill, we will have traded a usurper for a master. Are you prepared to return to Pella as the subordinates of an Athenian governor?" "No, my queen," the guard murmured, a glint of defiance mirroring the cold, hard fire in Eurydice's eyes. "Then we wait for the break," Queen commanded, her voice hardening into the iron cadence of a true sovereign. "We do not watch this to mourn the Athenians' success. We watch to see when the center collapses. When the confusion is at its peak, when Philip has drawn them deep into the mire and the usurper's line is fully ruptured, we move. We do not ride for the front. We ride for the path that secures our own sovereignty." Below, Iphicrates stood perfectly serene, calmly raising his iron sword. His pulse didn't even quicken. "They are tripping over their own boots," he murmured, before dropping his voice into a lethal, scratching friction that carried down the line. "Pierce them through. Leave none alive." Below, Iphicrates stood perfectly serene, calmly raising his iron sword. His pulse didn't even quicken. "They are tripping over their own boots," he murmured, before dropping his voice into a lethal, scratching friction that carried down the line. "Pierce them through. Leave none alive." The Athenian line did not commit the tactical absurdity of waiting for the impact. They lunged forward, a surge of motion unencumbered by the heavy, stifling bronze that anchored their foes. Their layered linen cuirasses allowed them to move with the terrifying velocity of absolute predators. The exact fraction of a second, the two front lines closed to zero. The usurper's mercenaries realized the fatal mathematics of their calculation. Their spears measured a meager 8 feet, while the Athenian weapons were Iphicratean colossi, 12 feet of perfectly balanced, lethal ash wood. "Maintain the distance," Iphicrates bellowed, his voice cutting through the wet, crunching cacophony of the initial impact. "Keep the range and slaughter them." Before Pausanias' men could even raise their shields, the Athenian points had shredded the threshold of the melee. The long, iron-tipped ash shafts blurred, snapping forward to punch through linen and leather with sickening ease. The heavy mercenaries were not merely being engaged, they were being gutted. Athenian points drove through eye sockets, snapping bone and emerging through the base of the skull in a spray of warm gray matter and jagged ivory. Others found the thin, unprotected gaps of the neck, severing jugulars and windpipes in one fluid, rhythmic stroke. The usurper's men stood in shock for a pulse beat, hands clawing at their own spraying throats before collapsing into the churning mud. It was a mechanical, cold-blooded execution. The Athenians remained casually stationed 4 feet beyond the reach of the enemy's clumsy, desperate blades. Their long spears darted like the tongues of vipers, executing variable stabs with industrial precision. Within minutes, the front of the usurper's formation was a tangled, bloody mire of shattered men, pinned to the earth by the relentless, unanswerable reach of the Athenian forest. My steel cannot reach them, a mercenary shrieked, his arms flailing wildly as his short spear poked uselessly at the air, a fraction of a second before a 12-foot ash shaft pulverized his larynx. They are too far. Philip and Attalus reined their mounts to a halt atop a rise that overlooked the carnage, the heavy, metallic scent of the slaughter drifting up on the cold wind. Below them, the trap had snapped shut. The Athenian phalanx moved with the terrifying mechanical inevitability of a glacier, their long ash with sarissas bristling forward like the spines of an angry beast. Philip watched as a wall of bronze and iron systematically erased the enemy ranks. He felt no triumph, only a cold crystalline focus. They aren't even fighting back, Attalus rasped, his voice thick with the gravel of age. He wiped a smear of mud from his cheek, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the raw, vicarious adrenaline of the hunt. Iphicrates has turned the field into a slaughter pen. It's efficient, cold, and entirely lacking in honor. Philip did not take his eyes off the Athenian line. This is not a battle, he thought, his jaw tightening until the muscle ached. This is a demonstration. Iphicrates is showing me exactly what a kingdom looks like when it is dismantled by a foreign hand. He isn't trying to win, Attalus, Philip murmured, his voice cutting through the distant rhythmic screams of the dying. He is trying to make me realize how small the Argead name truly is in the face of his geometry. Behind them, their loyalist horsemen sat in uneasy silence, hands white-knuckled on their reins. They had ridden into the jaws of death to serve as bait, expecting the adrenaline of a clash. Yet here they were, mere spectators to a systematic annihilation. Is this the rebirth we were promised? One of the younger riders muttered, eyes wide as he watched an Athenian sarissa find its mark with clinical precision. Philip turned his gaze toward the man, his expression unreadable, eyes reflecting the flickering orange light of the sunset upon the river. It is the cost of our independence, he replied, though the words tasted like ash. We stood in the van to draw them in. We did our part. Now we watch so that we never have to rely on his math again. Attalus let out a sharp, jagged sigh, watching the usurper's last disorganized pockets of resistance being blunted against the Athenian wall. He's leaving us nothing but the scraps of a victory. We are the royals, and yet we are being relegated to the role of witnesses to our own salvation. He thinks he has caged me, Philip thought, watching Iphicrates' calm, detached posture on the ridge. He thinks that by showing me this, he is teaching me my place. But he is showing me the exact weakness in his own design. The prince shifted his weight in the saddle, the familiar, grounding friction of the leather beneath him, a reminder that he was still in command of his own movement. Let him have his theater, Philip said, his voice dropping into a dangerous low register. He wants to be the master of this field. Let him finish the work. We have played the part he demanded, and the usurper is gone. When the sun rises tomorrow, the geography of this river will belong to whoever has the strength to hold it, and I intend to be the one who does. Driven to a frantic desperation, Pausanias signaled his Thracian heavy cavalry to aggressively assault the Athenian flank. Yet, Iphicrates did not even grant them the courtesy of turning his head. Slingers, he commanded clinically. From behind the forest of spears, a hidden vanguard of light skirmishers stepped out, their arms swinging in blurs of rhythmic speed. They unleashed an overwhelming deluge of lead bullets and heavy, iron-tipped javelins. The whistling of metal slicing through the mist dominated the battlefield, sounding like a swarm of gargantuan hornets. The lead bullets struck with the force of wawhammers. When they connected with bronze, the sound was not a chime, but a sickening, hollow crunch, shattering helmet crests, caving in faceplates and pulping the bone beneath. Skulls burst like overripe fruit, spraying gore across the shivering ranks, while other projectiles plunged into the soft, unprotected muscle of horses. The beasts screamed, a high, human-like shriek of agony, before crashing down, throwing their riders onto the jagged, blood-slicked rocks. The center of the usurper's formation instantaneously evaporated into a chaotic, screaming vortex of carnage. Faced with the stark reality of being systematically impaled by an absolute forest of thorns and impenetrable barrier they could not touch, let alone breach, the mercenaries' bravado shattered. They discarded their shields and breastplates to run, fleeing in a wild, disorganized panic. Iphicrates, his eyes cold and devoid of mercy, did not allow his men to halt for the temptation of plunder. No spoils until the perimeter of the frontier is secured. He roared into the wind, his blade dripping a steady trail of red as he pointed toward the fleeing masses. Do not give them the grace of a breath. Maintain the velocity. Pursue their very shadows until there is nothing left but dust and memory. At the forefront of the cavalry wedge, Philip rode beside Attalus, his heart drumming a frantic rhythm. He was no longer just the bait that had lured the usurpers' heavy infantry into their ruin. As the horses thundered through the churning mud, his 14-year-old intellect was actively decoding the future architecture of war. A profound, freezing clarity washed over him. He perceived a supreme truth. The massive weight of traditional Greek bronze was nothing more than a theatrical illusion, a clumsy relic of a dying past. Absolute dominance on the battlefield was governed exclusively by two mathematical variables, range and velocity. He had just witnessed the traditional hoplite phalanx, long recognized as the apex of military science, shattered into splinters by a force that operated with superior reach and speed. The Athenians win because they rewrite the distance, Philip thought, his chest rising and falling as he forced his mount through the carpet of dead mercenaries. They make the enemy's weapons useless before they can even strike. A fierce, burning ambition ignited deep within his gut, melting away any lingering sense of boyhood vulnerability. He looked at the long ashwood spear in his own hand, then back to the wreckage of the line. Macedonia did not have the silver mines of Athens nor the slave labor of Sparta, but it had mountains, it had timber, and it had thousands of rugged, battle-hardened peasants. Do not attempt to move a wall of bronze, his intellect synthesized amidst the screams, forging a blueprint that would change history. Transform the Macedonian soldiers themselves into an even longer, completely unyielding forest of long spears. This was the raw instruction he would eventually elevate to its absolute structural zenith. He wouldn't just copy Iphicrates, he would outcalculate him. He would push the mathematics of range to its absolute breaking point. This moment, embedded in the mud and blood of the front line, was the true, unwritten birth of the Macedonian Sarissa, the 18-foot colossus, destined to turn his impoverished peasantry into an unstoppable machine and redefine the parameters of the known world. The Haliacmon had ceased its restless, surging roar, falling into a silence so profound it felt heavy, like a held breath. The river, which had run the color of rusted iron through the long, brutal hours of the slaughter, now flowed with a sluggish, viscous clarity, its waters turning obsidian in the dying light. Philip, Attalus, and Parmenion sat motionless on their chargers at the water's edge. The valley, once a theater of screaming chaos, had transformed into a landscape of terrifying, surreal stillness. The setting sun struck the riverbanks with a low, slanted fire, turning the churned, blood-slicked mud and the discarded bronze of the dead into a grotesque, shimmering mosaic. Everything that had been broken, the twisted spears, the shattered faceplates, the heaps of mangled armor, glowed with an unearthly, polished brilliance, as if the earth were trying to gild its own wounds. The wind descended from the mountains, biting and sharp, carrying the metallic tang of cooling iron and the final, lingering scent of the day's work. The Athenians and Thebans had already begun their retreat, their silhouettes dissolving into the gathering gloom, like ghosts leaving a haunted house, leaving the field to the victors. Philip looked down at his own hands, his gauntlets crusted in a dark, drying patina that caught the last of the light. He felt no triumph, only a cold, hollow clarity that echoed the stillness of the valley. He had achieved the impossible. He had broken the usurper and outmaneuvered the generals. Yet as he watched the sun sink behind the jagged peaks, the victory felt less like a celebration and more like the first, agonizing step of a long journey. Attalus sat slumped in his saddle, his aging face etched with the weariness of a man who had seen too many such fields, his eyes tracing the red-stained ripples of the Haliacmon. Parmenion remained the portrait of disciplined composure, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his features unreadable, his mind already calculating the next shift in the wind. "We won," Philip murmured, his voice barely audible against the rising, whistling chill of the valley floor. The words seemed to hang in the frigid air, small and fragile against the vast, stained theater of their success. They did not cheer. They did not raise their blades. They simply sat, three figures silhouetted against the morbid beauty of the bloodscape, watching the night claim the Haliacmon. The war was over, but as the first stars emerged to peer down at the carnage, Philip knew the true weight of the crown had only just begun to settle. To be continued in episode 36, Anatomy of Slaughter. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.